Good afternoon, good afternoon. Nick Lanzon here. Another beautiful day in East Tennessee. Hope you're doing alright. Today I want to talk about who was King James, how did the King James Bible come to be, and which Bible translation is the best for you. Stick around. James became King of Scotland at just 1 year old when his mother fled to England in 1567. He was openly bisexual. The joke in London was, we had Elizabeth the King, and now we have James the Queen. The Roman Catholics had high hopes for James, with his distaste in Scottish Presbyterians, hoping he would lift the restraints on worship put in place by Queen Elizabeth, but they were wrong. So a group of well-connected Catholic terrorists planned to blow up the entire political structure at the opening of Parliament in 1605. They brought in an explosives expert, who organized placing 2.5 tons of gunpowder in a cellar under the Palace of Westminster, changing the outlook of the Roman Catholic Church, understandably. But James had more sympathy for high church rather than low church, because the followers of Protestant sects didn't want priests and bishops doing religion on their behalf. They believed the godly man had his own Bible, and the devil's agent is a priest with a Catholic prayer book. King James believed that people that didn't respect the hierarchy in church would be equally disrespectful of authority in general. No bishop, no king was his mindset, and the authority of the king was very dear to him. His intellectual take on the role was that he was God's deputy, and that he ruled by divine right, as the absolute sovereign power in England. Being raised in Scotland, he was baffled at the idea of common law. The notion that law was in the hands and the minds of the people, expressed through the presidents of the courts and their juries of ordinary folks. One example of his sense of power and duty was in his treatment of tobacco. He disliked smoking and felt it was his duty to protect his subjects. So he wrote a pamphlet, A Counterblast to Tobacco, which read, Loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black stinking fume thereof, therefore nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit, which is bottomless. He wanted to sway people by the force of his argument, so he published it, anonymously. Of course no one took any notice, so in result, he banned the growing of tobacco in England, and increased the customs duty on tobacco by 4,100%, and reissued the pamphlet with his name on it. In James's mind, kingship existed above the law and was the law. But that's just not how it was in England. And being James, he not only understood that this was the problem, he said so, as a matter of principle. And when the Lord Chief Justice disagreed, the Lord Chief Justice got the sack. It was said that King James was the wisest fool in Christendom. As for how the King James Bible came to be, we have to go back to 1603. When James was on his way to coronation and was stopped by a delegation of Puritans who presented him with a list of grievances and their purposed reforms. It was signed by over 1,000 clergymen, which was 10% of England's clergy at the time. The new King James called for a meeting at the Hampton Court Palace to address their concerns, which took place in 1604. The Puritans weren't allowed to attend the first day of the conference, and James largely disregarded most of their requests, due to his pre-existing distaste for underlings being involved in the decision-making of the high church. Eventually, Dr. John Reynolds, leading Puritan voice at the conference, brought up the idea of a Bible translation, because those which were allowed in the reign of King Henry VIII and King Edward VI were corrupt and not answerable to the truth of the original. James, who hated the popular Geneva Bible for its anti-royalty message, agreed that a new translation would be for the best. The new translation didn't begin until 1607. 54 Bible experts, only 48 were recorded because some of them died before the translation was completed. They all gathered together at Oxford, Westminster, and Cambridge to discuss the translation. They came from all levels of religion, and all had different ideas of the reform that they wanted to see. They're to follow 15 rules of translation, including making no notes in the margins of the Bible and keeping the language accessible to the common people, many of which were illiterate at the time. The translators were broken into subcommittees, each translator independently translating the same section of the Bible, which was then brought back to the subcommittee. All the translations were compared, and then one was chosen to be sent back to the General Revising Committee. Because most of the audience was illiterate, they wanted it to sound right rather than look right. If it didn't sound good, the General Committee would then debate and revise the passage until it did. Then they would send the approved passages to a few bishops, who would then send them to the Archbishop of Canterbury, who then would send it to King James, who had the final say in the approval of the new translation. It was finally completed in 1610, but didn't become available to the public until the following year. It was printed by Robert Barker, King James's personally appointed printer. Unfortunately, the new translation was so anticipated that it was rushed into print and many mistakes were made. He paid £3,500 for the rights to publish the new translation, and then spent even more to try to fix all the mistakes and fend off pirating publishers. By 1635, Robert Barker was in debtor's prison, where he later died. A couple of the typos in the early new translation include God's greatness reading great ass, and the word not being left out of the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. Because of these errors, it's not much of a surprise why the new King James translation was largely unpopular and referred to as the Wicked Bible. Over time, the new translation took on a number of revisions and eventually included new chapter summaries and marginal references that were verified for accuracy, increasing the popularity of the new King James translation of the Bible. So which Bible do you choose? You've got the NASB, New American Standard Bible, ESV, English Standard Version, KJV, King James Bible, NIV, New International Version, NLT, New Living Translation, GNT, Good News Translation, or otherwise known as the Good News Bible, and the MSG, the Message Bible. Overall, each one of these translations are the inspired Word of God, given to us for instruction. The famous acronym that I am also fond of, Basic Instructions Before Leaving Earth. This inspiration from God was given to roughly 40 authors to form 66 books over the span of 1,500 years. The thing is, the original inspired Word of God was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The Old Testament, mostly written in Hebrew with some Aramaic, and the New Testament, mostly written in Greek. So you're left to choose a translation, unless you're fluent in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. To start, we have the New American Standard Version, the NASB. There's two things to consider. On one end of the translation spectrum, you have word for word, and on the other end, you have thought for thought. The NASB is considered to be the closest word-for-word translation there is to accommodate modern English. Next up is the ESV, the English Standard Version, which is mostly word-for-word with the slightest thought-for-thought dynamic, making it just a little bit more understandable. Then we have the King James Version, KJV, which is still held to be the standard in many modern churches, but contains such an old English style of speaking that it can be quite difficult to digest if you're not already familiar with the text. Next up is the NIV, New International Version. The good thing about the New International Version is the fairly even mix of thought-for-thought, word-for-word dynamic. This version is much easier to read and understand. Next up is the New Living Translation, NLT. This version now slides more into the thought-for-thought rather than word-for-word. Now we have the Good News Bible, which is used in a lot of cases with people or kids that don't speak English as their first language, being very popular with overseas missionaries. The last one is the MSG, the Message Bible. Some would say you really couldn't even call it a translation, but more of a paraphrase. It's actually one of the most criticized Bibles out there, because quite literally it's a pastor's interpretation in a highly readable, digestible story of the Bible. It actually reads more like a novel, with chapter markers but no verses. And this is probably still worth a read and gives to the good of the cause, but definitely not recommendable as your only Bible or a version to study. Now with all that said, I would recommend the King James Version or the English Standard Version for study. Even the New American Standard Version if you want to step it up a notch. Or the NIV, New International Version, if you're looking for an easier to read and easier to understand translation. Well, I hope this has been informative. Happy studies. God bless. Till next time. Cheers.